And hi, welcome to All Things Conflict with me, your host, Maria Arpa. And, it's a very special date because it is 1 year of podcasting. Yes, this is our 1 year anniversary. And I am absolutely delighted with the year as it's gone on. I'm very grateful to our production team at Disruptive Media and also to Tom Ford, who basically looks after everything that I do and everywhere I go. None of this would have happened without his support. And I'd love to just, if you would indulge me, I would love to take a minute to reflect on 60 episodes, 44 guests, 2 case studies, and we dealt with conflict in the workplace. We had 9 episodes about conflict in the workplace with guests like Jackie Moulton, who was a police whistleblower, and Michelle Cox, who made a landmark employment tribunal case. We moved on to looking at leadership and boardrooms and how conflict plays out in various differing scenarios. And we spoke to Simon Woodruff, who of course was the founder of Yo Sushi. We also spoke to Murray Steele, who is a person that trains non-executive directors. We met John Cullum, who was CEO of a large car manufacturing company. David Liddell, who of course is one of my peers and colleagues in the field of conflict resolution. We did a special episode on forgiveness with supervision guru Robin Shohet. And then we moved our focus onto conflict in the criminal justice system. We've spoken to people with lived experience. We've spoken to some fabulous people who are making things better in the world, giving of themselves, running projects that exceed all expectations. And it's been a real honour to be alongside all of my guests, every single person that has shared their story or their ideas or the things that they're doing in the world, their achievements. It's been really humbling. And what have we got to look forward to? Well, at some point soon, I'll be moving the focus and moving the radar towards relationships, couples, parenting, divorce, separation, and then on to academia, education. And beyond that, we've got many ideas that we're playing around with, people that we're speaking to. And if there's something or a topic that you would really enjoy hearing about or listening to and understanding more about, just get in touch. We'd love to hear your ideas. And now I'm kind of my own guest on this episode when I'm going to be talking to you about power and control in relationships, toxic relationships and abuse, because this is a topic that touches everyone. So I hope you enjoy this solo episode. Let's dive in. So in this episode of All Things Conflict with me, Maria Arpa, I'm actually sort of my own guest, if you like. I decided I wanted to do an episode based on this subject of justice redesigned. We've had so many amazing guests, each coming with a different piece of the puzzle, if you like. But I wanted to really go deeper into, what is justice? How do we play out justice in our society? And what is justice, actually? I mean, I've looked at many sources, and one that sort of sang to me and I've kind of played with a bit is that we could think of justice as a way of allocating rights, resources, and resolution in a way that is fair and impartial and just while also upholding responsibility and accountability. And I mean, there may be other and wider ways of looking at justice. There are lots of different forms of justice. Justice isn't just about laws, there is natural justice. And we can think of how we allocate, how we distribute, how we think about justice in relation to food and ecology, the environment, water. And then there's the way we distribute things. There's procedural justice, informational justice, participatory justice. And in the end, isn't it all about getting to something that is fair? And then we have to think about who decides what is fair, because every one of us has a fairness button. And for some people, their fairness button is really close to the surface and can be triggered at any kind of perceived or real injustice or lack of fairness. I mean, the place where I think most about this is in classrooms. One of the things that children say to me over and over again is one of the things they really hate is when 2 or 3 children in a classroom are disruptive or doing something that isn't in alignment with how the classroom needs to be to foster an environment of learning, but 2 or 3 children break those rules or whatever and the whole class gets punished. When we don't look at things from the perspective of individual and collective. So there are many ways in which our fairness buttons go off, and there are many ways in which we can interpret what is fair. If I've led a particular life, if I come from a particular cultural background, I may understand something to be fair very differently from someone sitting across the table from me. Some of that could be to do with customs, tradition, heritage. I mean, I was listening to a webinar a few months ago that sort of talked about if you take Indigenous people where their land has been taken away from them, and then you try to ignore that in the way that you think about fairness, and you say, well, no, we're all the same, but your land's been taken away from you, and there is a strong sort of mourning or grief about that. We can't just ignore it. So I really wanted to sort of dig a bit deeper into how I have manoeuvred my way through justice systems and conclusions that I've come to, which, are just my opinion. I mean, based on some, real on the ground work, based on some research, based on some, real life, real time results, if you like. And I'm putting it out there. It's more to stimulate a conversation. It's more, I'm not trying to be right about anything. I'm trying to say there are other ways we could look at how we do things in society. And does that touch anything in you? We've heard from many guests in this series who are doing their piece, they're doing their part. Because as I keep saying, and I won't tire of saying, even if we had the best government and unlimited resources, nothing will change or happen on its own. We need to support things, whether that's through campaigning or whether that's actually through compassion or whether that's actually through just getting your hands dirty. We've all got a part to play in how we receive and give justice to ourselves and to others. So in our mainstream society, by that I mean the way I grew up in the UK, we largely use a system of justice that I call retributive, or is known as retributive justice. And so retributive justice is all about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's all about, what's gone wrong and how do we punish people for it? How do we teach people a lesson for what they've done? So the three main questions that are asked in that system is, what law or rule has been broken? Who broke it? What's the punishment? And most people can recognise that as what happens in criminal justice, what happens in our policing systems, what happens in our schools and in our institutions. And, having been doing this work for the best part of 30 years, I can tell you I don't think it's that useful. And why would I say that? Well, we've been using this prison system, we've been using a retributive justice system for a few thousand years. And if the idea was to teach people a lesson, well, surely by now our prisons would be empty. Surely by now, after thousands of years, we would have learned our lesson and have passed it on down the line, so that we've cleared it up. But it doesn't. It actually seems to generate more of the same. In fact, so much so that we have whole industries, we have livelihoods dependent on perpetuating such a system. And think about that for a moment. So asking for change, pushing for change, challenging these systems is incredibly difficult, because there is a lot invested in keeping things going the way they've been going. Oh, for sure, there are reforms. For sure, there are things get looked at and adjustments are made. I mean, I'm not saying it's fixed. And sometimes those things can make a huge difference, and sometimes they push everything back. We had a guest who talked about the time a Justice Secretary banned books for prisoners. And then, someone putting that right and saying, actually, let's allow families to send books in, so they don't even have to buy them, so that all these kinds of adjustments are being made all over the time. Reform is a constant thing. And yet, for where I sit and for what I see, it's just not enough. It's just not enough. I came across this wonderful quote, and I'm not quite sure where it came from, because it seems to have been added to, and then when I put the whole thing together, I couldn't sort of find it to attribute it. But it's something that touches me very deeply, and it was, no justice without truth. No truth without forgiveness. No forgiveness without mercy, and no mercy without love. And something resonates very deeply for me about that, because at the basis of everything we're trying to do in our common humanity has to be love and mercy and forgiveness and truth, in order to get to this place called justice. Justice isn't something that can be meted out. Of course, that is part of the way we do it. We push people through a system, and then at the end of the day, there's a jury or a judge or some kind of arbitrator or somebody further up the hierarchical system who decides how it's going to be. But if we constantly remove every individual's capability and capacity to find justice within themselves, then what we do is we take away the potential for people to take self-responsibility. I've sat in many mediations, I've sat in many
circles or with groups of people facilitating or mediating, where, the start of the conversation is traditionally just blame everybody else, lots of, who's at fault and this happened and that, and going over, chewing over what all the wrongs that had happened. And then bit by bit, with careful and compassionate and skillful facilitation, we can bring people into admissions of their part in that. How did they contribute to the outcome? And then very gradually some joint responsibility taking, or being able to identify what it was that I did and what it was that you did. And then when we can start to have those conversations where it becomes safe to say it, safe to talk about it, then we can get to more honesty and more truth and more understanding. And then we can begin to get to, and how do we repair this? And that brings me on to another form of justice, which has been around for thousands and thousands of years. And there's been many attempts to kind of highlight it, bring it in to our mainstream society, and that's called restorative justice. And in restorative justice, we say that education is the key to correction. Education is the key to change. So how does that work? So where in the retributive justice, the three main questions were, who broke the law? What law was broken? Who broke it? What's the punishment? In this way of looking at justice, we ask, what is the injury, loss or harm? Who sustained it? And how do we repair from that? Which gives agency to everybody, directly and indirectly impacted, to come together and rebuild. So I have my own inimitable saying, which is, shit has happened, shit is happening, and shit is going to happen in the future. And what really matters is how we deal with it. Are the relationships important? Are there going to be continuing relationships? What actually matters here that will get us forward to or back to harmony, safety, and our ability to continue society in a way where we feel that we can belong, we can be included, and that we've learned some lessons. And the restorative justice movement has been around for a long time. And actually, if we go right back, it really does come from indigenous cultures. Yes, in indigenous and tribal cultures, yes, there has very much been an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But there has also been, in other cultures, restorative practices where there wasn't a word for punishment. That idea just didn't exist. The idea is that we accept that things are going to go wrong. We accept that people are going to make mistakes. And we use education as prevention, and we use education as reform. And the idea is that unless we're going to actually murder people, unless we're actually going to take someone's life, then they are on the planet and among us. And the idea that we can have division and separation, I can create distance between me and somebody else. And sometimes that's really important. And I can create distance by removing people from society. But at some point, they're coming back. So separation and division are concepts, but they don't actually really exist, because as long as there's a thing called gravity that keeps you on the planet and me on the planet, and the energy is circulating, then we are part of one organism. And in fact, I like to think of humans as just being a moving part in an ecosystem called, nature or Mother Earth. And it's up to us to play our part. Although it's very easy to get into despair about the way humans treat the resources that we have been given. And that's a whole nother kind of episode on justice and environmental justice and how we use and distribute the resources amongst us. Because if we think of justice from those terms, then the world is completely unjust. So I really would like to talk more about this concept of injury, loss or harm, and how that really changes the lens away from, who broke the rule. Because sometimes rules in themselves are ridiculous. And the reason that humans made rules or laws was it was a way for us to be able to live together in harmony and have a set of common agreements, a sort of code of conduct, if you like, by which we could all sort of have common ground for trusting each other. That was the purpose. It was supposed to serve life. And that's really important to hold on to. Rules and laws are there to serve life. When we find life having to serve the rules or having to serve laws, in my opinion, we are completely in the wrong place. So when we tell a child that they have to go home because they're wearing the wrong shoes, is that rules serving life, or is that life serving the rules? And we won't know that until we have the dialogue. Because is there a genuine reason? Is there a life-serving reason that it's great for children to wear the right shoes? It could be health and safety, it could be equality, it could be fairness, there are all sorts of reasons. Or was it just somebody's, in hierarchical structures, personal preference? And we need to be able to examine that. We need to be able to challenge those things. So when I talk about injury, loss or harm, there are tangible actions, tangible incidents, tangible things that take place where we can clearly define, we can clearly see what is that injury or loss or harm or all three. And how did it come about? Is there a person or a group of people that are responsible? And who was directly impacted and who was indirectly impacted by these actions or incidents, so that we can actually have a reasoned and sensible conversation between everyone, including the people who take responsibility for this. And when we open up our humanity in this way, and the people who are responsible are not having to worry about their professional body or their reputation or the media, there's more likelihood, in my experience, of people being able to own and confront and work with the harm that they have visited on others. And injury, loss or harm has to be definable. And this is the bit that some people are going to find challenging or controversial. Hurt feelings does not constitute injury, loss or harm. I'm going to say that again. Hurt feelings does not constitute injury, loss or harm. We cannot live together in a society and walk around expecting that we will never have our feelings hurt. That comes to a different place. So I'm not saying that people can proactively go out and deliberately attempt to hurt people's feelings. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when my feelings are hurt, that is an opportunity for growth. That is an absolute opportunity for dialogue, for growth, for understanding, for education, for mutuality. And it's a journey. It's a journey. But to shut everyone down that hurts my feelings actually limits my own ability to expand and grow and take my full place in society. And I'll go one step further. My feelings are my own. My feelings belong to me. How I feel in response to some kind of stimulus, how I feel is individual and unique to me, and only arises out of the life I have lived, the traumas I have faced, the joys I have lived through, the many experiences, the environment around me, my belief systems, what I was taught, what I was shown. That makes my response, my reactions, and how I feel unique to me. So nobody can make me feel anything. I can have a response or a reaction to a stimulus, but the feelings are in me and they arise according to who I am and how I have lived and how I see the world and the lens I choose to look through. And if we perpetuate the idea that other people can make me feel something, then actually what we do is we perpetuate a victim mentality in society, because I'm now at the mercy of whatever's thrown at me. And I'm not. That doesn't mean to say that when things arise and I feel a certain way, that I can challenge, I can come to the table, I can ask, I can sit with, I can seek counsel. There are all sorts of things I can do that make me curious. So the things I do that make me curious and interested and even more determined to be included and to be able to participate in society. And then go on to make my contribution. And that's really interesting because it very nicely segues back to the injury, loss or harm. Because one of the things that happens with injury, loss or harm is when we look at the people who have been directly impacted, there are basically three questions that those people ask consciously or unconsciously. And the first is, why me? So why did this happen to me? And the second question is, why now? Like, how did this happen now? How did it come about at this time? And because people need answers, they need understanding, they need to make sense. We need to make sense of the nonsense that goes on in the world. But the third and most important question is, how can we ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else? And when we block that conversation, we lose out on a richness in society that is sometimes sorely missing. And the evidence of that, the evidence of how do we stop this happening to other people, are all the people who've ever been through, the death of a loved one or the loss of a body part, or, I'm just making stuff up now, who've experienced injury, loss or harm. And how many people set up trusts and foundations or raise money for charities that do this work or dedicate themselves to change in some way. And that's all in pursuit of a restorative, natural justice, a way of prevention, a way of learning and expanding and growing. So in my world of restorative justice, there are many ways in which we administer that procedurally. So at the very first step is looking at the world through the lens of injury, loss or harm, and asking those questions. What is the injury, loss or harm? Who sustained it? How do we repair? Instead of going, well, who broke the rule? What's the punishment? And so the first level of this practice is to see the world through a different lens. And then the second level is, how do we put that on show? How do I administer that in my day-to-day life? How do I open my heart? How do I show you that I see the world through this lens? And that actually does involve looking at how we make agreements together in society. So it overturns some of the way that we make laws that are rigid and we have no leeway. And that's really important, because of all the people I've met in prison, there's always a context. And what rule's been broken, who broke it, and how do we punish them? It doesn't want to understand. It doesn't want to involve context. And it's too big a subject to go into in a short sort of podcast episode like this, but I can say much more about that. But I could give you like a really simple example. If somebody has been abused as a child, it's gone unnoticed, it's been a secret. When they have tried to speak about it, it's been shut down, they haven't been believed. And this goes on far more than you'll ever realise, unless you work in this field. And then that's buried. But there are certain things that child learned about safety in the world. There are certain things about how to be safe, how to keep safe, what you can trust, what you can't trust, and how one might react in the face of that trauma being resurrected. And then that person grows up and goes into the world. Maybe they try to numb their pain through addictions, through alcoholism, through all sorts of, some may seemingly more positive than others, but through distractions. And then something re-traumatizes that person and they lose control, because no healing ever took place, because there wasn't a journey through supported feeling of the pain, working through the now I'm a grown up. So something sits suppressed under the surface, it gets re-triggered, and there we have, the crime, which we then just punish. Now, interestingly enough, when we do that, and we never actually hear or listen to that person's journey to ending up where they've ended up, I'm not sure that the punishment model can work, because now that person is still busy trying to heal. So if I'm busy trying to heal, if everything's been thrown up and I'm in complete and utter turmoil, the trauma's going round, and now I'm facing the punishment, and now I'm trying to manage all of it at once, that person can hear very little. The chances of them wanting to learn at this stage of their life is pretty low. I'm not saying a person can't sleepwalk their way through courses and being told what to do, and we can certainly threaten people into compliance, but the actual learning and the transformation didn't take place. And we can see that play out because reoffending rates are through the roof. by now there are going to be some people listening to this, if you've made it this far, who are going, oh no, this is terrible, and people have to be punished and all the rest of it. And actually, for me, punishment isn't the tool that we need. And please at least respect that I've been doing this work for 30 years on the ground. And what I see that works is, what is the journey for a person who has perpetrated injury, loss or harm on themselves, others or society? What is the journey for them to take responsibility, to feel the feelings, to come face to face, take responsibility, be accountable, and feel the remorse and the regret for a life poorly lived, to the point where they want to do better? And one way in which a person can do better is to come back into society, get work, and pay taxes into the system. That is one way in which a person, at the very least, can come back and make amends. So in a restorative process, all the people affected, alongside a few impartial community members, will sit in dialogue, and work through what happened, how did it come about, what are our individual responsibilities, what is a collective responsibility, what did we co-create as a society, and what's the best we can do in this situation to find some kind of reparation. Now, at a really extreme level, David, my husband, and I, we saw a news item several years ago about a family who had kept a man as a slave in their garage. I don't know what right pronunciation is, but anyway. And they got caught on their own CCTV footage. They literally made this man sleep on a hard floor. He wasn't allowed to wash. He was literally a slave. And the poor man had learning difficulties. And they'd kept him like it for years. Anyway, they went to prison. But how does that help this guy? How does that help the slave, the man who was kept as a slave? So in my world, in a restorative circle, first of all, it's really important that the family that did this understand and come to a realization, whatever we need to wake up in those people, something needs to wake up for them to be able to say, this was absolutely wrong. This was not a thing that any human should do to another human. And from that realization, then we can start to ask, well, how do we put this right? And putting this right, to me, would be that we allow this family to go to work under close monitoring. They are allowed to eat and pay rent or whatever, but they've got to provide for this man now, probably for the rest of his life. They have to make some kind of restitution, because otherwise society pays that bill. They go to prison, society pays another bill. And, it isn't all about money, but we are money driven in society. So again, that would be a whole nother conversation about how we've ended up here with money being the driving force. But within the system we're working in, everyone's paying for it except the people that actually deprived somebody of his life. So back to a restorative circle or a restorative conference or a restorative meeting or a restorative dialogue, we would absolutely be focused on how are amends made, who's going to make those amends, and actually what you come out with is a timed, measurable action plan. So who's doing what and by when, And how will we know it's worked? And what do we do if it falls over and goes wrong? I've seen this work many, many times. I've seen it in action. I've facilitated some of those meetings. I've learned from people that have done this far greater than me. And I've seen the theory and the practice, and I understand this. And it's an invitation, I guess. I guess maybe I could invite you to think about, as you move around in life, just think about what is the injury, loss or harm, in your family, within the small stuff, how we're treating our children. So when a child misbehaves, not a word I like to use, but it's a popular word, and it's a shorthand for when a child isn't in alignment with the way we want to be in our family, or the way that we want things to run, then it's really important to ask ourselves a question: is what I am about to do or say worth the cost to the relationship? Because the relationship is going to continue. And when we do things that create a cost to the relationship, we might not see that cost manifest until later on. That cost might not show up until your child is bigger than you are, or might not show up until the day you absolutely need their goodwill to get something done or to move something forward. It might not show up until you lose contact. So within restorative justice, we pay great attention to the continuation of relationships, because we're not islands. We don't live on our own. And if people piss you off that much and you don't want to be around, you find it hard to be around people, go and live on your own in a cave, because the world works on relationships and goodwill. And we're so used to hearing about all the bad stuff, all the terrible stuff that goes on. But guess what? I can walk to the wall and flick a switch, and I can be 99.9% recurring sure that the lights are going to come on. I can plug in my laptop and be 99% sure that I've got a gateway to the world through the internet. That only happens through relationships. It only happens because people are talking to each other and co-creating and making things happen and collaborating. And there is much more collaboration going on in the world than there is competition and dishonouring. I know that seems very hard to take on board, and I know that that's probably no comfort to people who are experiencing extreme loss, pain, war, man-made trauma and disaster. And yet it exists. And I guess I wonder what the world would be like if we could make that shift into a more restorative lens, a restorative approach, and a restorative justice procedure. And on that note, when I do these talks, it's all about leaving you with more questions than answers, but I'm really happy to get into any kind of conversation or take your feedback or your comments. So thank you for listening.